Okay guys, Alec, Peirce, Vintage Scuba, and we're going to deal with a very interesting topic. In fact, this particular episode is directly an answer to somebody's question or comment on my, I forget your name, I apologize for that, but somebody said to me, I took my old 72 cubic foot tank into a dive store to have it tested and filled, and they wouldn't test it or fill it because it has a coating on the inside. What do I do? Well, here's your answer, okay? And other divers have asked as well. Some guys said, I love my 72. I love my 72. So what's the scoop here? What's this 72 thing? Maybe some of you aren't that old yet. You don't know what a 72 is. But let's talk about it very briefly. The current tank of choice for scuba diving is the aluminum 80. All you tech divers that are using steel tanks, relax. Okay? They're great for what you're doing. And a lot of recreational divers use them too. But you can't argue the fact that the most common scuba tank used in the world today, the aluminum 80. If you take in all of the South Pacific, all of the Caribbean, Florida, California, right across Canada, and a lot of Europe and so on, that's what they use. Millions and millions of them. So that's a moot point. The most common tank used today is aluminum 80. There are lots of other versions, but that's it. Prior to about 1985 or thereabouts, say in 1990, let's say for sure, prior to 1990, and going back right back to the 60s, so about 30 years, the most common tank used by recreational scuba divers, was in fact a tank called the 72, steel 72, current aluminum 80, steel 72. It was called a steel 72 for a couple of reasons. One, it was made of steel. No problem there. It was called a 72 because it held 65 cubic feet. Let me explain. The steel tank, when they were made, had a test date on them, the original test date. Sometimes commonly called the manufacture date. Let's not get into an argument about it. Often they were manufactured and stored for quite a while until a scuba distributor called up and ordered a whole bunch. They would take them out of storage, test them, stamp them, and ship them. So the manufacture date and the test date are not necessarily the same. If they were manufactured and tested on the same day, then that date would be the manufacture date, wouldn't it? But it's still the test date. Anyway, you have a test date. So the test date on this great old 72, by the way, I think 72s are fantastic. I love the 72. You'll see why in a minute. The test date on here is December 1969. 50 years old, this tank. Anyway, after the test date, 12, and it has a symbol in there that represents the testing company, and then 69. Right after that, there's a plus sign, a little plus sign, plus. Okay, you don't get that on tanks anymore. But what that meant at that time was that you could fill this tank 10% over. Yeah. So whatever the working pressure stamped on it was, you could add 10% more. The working pressure on this tank is 2250, 2,250 psi. Now quickly, I'm pretty good at math, I'll do it for you. 10% of 2250 is 225. 2250 plus 225 is 2475. So this tank could be filled to 2475. Okay? At 2475, it holds 71.2 cubic feet. Now you and I both know that when you round up or round down numbers, if it's less than 0.5, you round them down. If it's more, you round them up. But 71.2, they rounded it up to 72 because it sounds better. It sounds like more. Yeah, the distributor company, 71.2. Well, that's almost 72. We'll call it a 72. So you have a steel tank that would hold, if it was pressurized, over pressure, it would hold 71.2, called 72, steel 72. That's the tank that was used for many, many, many years. So these tanks came in many versions. Now when I say versions, I don't mean that the tank changed. The shape, the neck, the 3/4 inch valve, there were 1/2 inch pipe threads originally, but the 3/4 inch valve and so on, all that didn't change very much. A little bit depending on the manufacturer. And by the way, let me clarify one more thing. U.S. divers, Aqualung, never made a tank on their life. Decor never made a tank on their life. Sportsways, Voigt, They never made a tank in their life. No, these tanks, this is a highly involved, extremely sophisticated, and very expensive operation to make a tank. Trust me. You can read about it, go on to YouTube, how do you make a scuba tank. It takes a lot of money. There are companies that make scuba tanks, high-pressure tanks, not just scuba, but high-pressure tanks. And all those companies, U.S. Divers, Aqualung, Sportsways, they're not around anymore, Sherwood, Scuba Pro, all those companies, they buy the tanks in those companies, and they put their name on them. Sometimes, as in this case, this says U.S. Divers. They actually have it printed right, they have the manufacturer. I'll make sure you stamp it U.S. Divers so that people think it was made by them. That doesn't matter. So these tanks were made, and they were excellent. They lasted about an hour at a modest depth, 30 to 40 to 50 feet. And for recreational divers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that's how deep we dove. We didn't make stupid deep dives. We used one of these tanks. If you were pretty good in the water, they'd last you an hour, give you a nice long dive in the water. So, what's this about good and bad? What's this about coatings? Okay, let's deal with the outside first. The outside of these tanks came in various versions. Some were painted. And the whole idea behind these coatings, by the way, whether it's an internal or external coating, the whole idea was to protect the tank. It's steel. Yeah, steel. That stuff that rusts. We're going to take it in the water. And we're going to leave it laying around in the basement or the garage. You see? It's not going to last very long unless we do something to protect it. So let's paint it. Yeah, we'll give it a nice coat of paint. And they did that. They give it a nice coat of paint. It didn't last very long because they didn't realize that this tank expands. It measurably, if you put a tape measure tightly around this tank and measured it, and then filled it and measured it again, it'd be bigger. Yeah, it actually grows and then it shrinks when you empty it. Grows and shrinks. Paint doesn't last very long. So they soon had to develop special paint. So then they developed an epoxy paint. It's a very tough paint. Really, you can't chip it, it sticks on there. But it still would crack after a while. As it dried and got harder and harder and more brittle, it would still crack. So then they tried plastic dipping. There was some tanks and they have a coating on it. And the coating would be 1/4 of an inch thick. When they went to do a hydro test, they would have to cut the coating out because they had to stamp right on the metal. They cut the piece of the coating out, cut it out like this, and chip it all out, then stamp on the metal. Well, that cut out section, you could see the coating on there might be a 1/16, an 1/8 of an inch thick. Didn't help. They still rusted on the outside. Yeah, you had to be very, very careful, very fastidious to keep them clean. The boot, I think you can see, you can zoom down there just for a second, Kevin. Can you see that white line at the top of the boot? It's called corrosion. This boot is tight-fitting, but water gets in there. I bet you if I take that boot off, Kevin, it's all, see how, look, it's white around here where the band used to be. That's saltwater corrosion. So the coating wasn't very good. Some of the tanks eventually decided, let's galvanize the outside. Now, galvanizing is hot dipped in a metal, a lot of zinc compound. I don't know the exact details, I'll have to read it up again, but it's hot dipped into a metal that makes a tight coating on the steel and protects it, and that is the best. A galvanized tank is the best. Unless you actually grind through that with sandpaper or steel wool or a file down to the steel, the original steel, that won't rust. So here's the tank that's 40 years old. Show me some rust. No rust on it. This white on there, that would disappear with a bit of rubbing. Yeah. So galvanized coating on the outside was the best, despite all the others. Okay, now what about this internal coating? Well, for the very same reason, trying to avoid rust in steel tanks, because it became pretty apparent early on that tanks were rusting and they were causing problems, usually in dive stores where the rusting would be bad, and in the 50s, you would take your tank in and it'd be rusted, it hadn't been filled for a while, and outside looked nice. You shine the outside of the car, but the frame is rusting through, same thing. And a dive store employee would fill that tank and it would blow up. And subsequently, we now have a visual program. So the tanks have to be inspected inside every year, sometimes more often, to be sure that the inside is in good shape. So in an effort back then to protect the tank from rusting on the inside, there were inside coatings, interior coatings. And they tried various things. They tried paint. They tried epoxy. Again, various things on the inside. Didn't work. And for largely the same reason. There were two problems with them. The first is that they would crack. Now sometimes, depending on the paint that was used, if it was a flexible paint, which made a lot of sense, right? The paint wouldn't crack. But it would get hairline cracks if it let air through that had moisture in it, and so the steel underneath that coating was rusting. You just couldn't see it. And these were discovered the hard way. Yeah, there'd be a tank. Oh, that looks really good. Nice and clean inside. Fill it up. Boom. You see? So this was a trial and error process back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. If you see some old divers around and they were scuba diving in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, you go over and give them a pat in the back. Not me. I mean, I was, but don't pat me in the back. But if you do, because those guys went through a lot. It wasn't easy back then. There were no dive stores. The air fills weren't good. The gear was questionable. The tanks blew up and all kinds of neat things. Oh, it was exciting. Right? So that was what they tried. There are some interesting things they tried as well. Voight, in particular, a very big company, they had a product called the Lifeliner. Lifeliner. You like that? Catchy name, right? And it was a plastic bag. Picture a Ziploc bag, that kind of material. And it was made to be the exact same shape as the interior of a scuba tank. Pretty cool, eh? And so you would take the valve out, and you would feed the Lifeliner down inside, blow some air in so it popped out, and it covered the whole inside of the tank. Pretty cool. And then it came right up through the neck, and you put the valve back in, and your tank was protected. Nope. Because the valve cut through the plastic, air leaked in, moist air leaked in there, tank rusted, and the Lifeliner was only around for a couple of years. Maybe Kevin can find an ad about the Lifeliner. I probably have one if you don't, Kevin. It was a pretty neat, but unfortunately, disastrous idea. So, and those coatings on the inside, you can tell them instantly. Plain steel has a plain gray look. The coatings were usually white. There was a sort of a light pink one. There was a dark brown coating as well. And I don't know the different paints that were used, but those are the colors I recall from many years of inspecting tanks. So here's the bottom line. Now, if you have a steel 72 tank and it's galvanized on the outside, take it into the dive store and they'll do a visual. Visuals are just a few bucks. Don't do a hydro first. Do a visual. They'll look inside and they'll see what the inside looks like. If it's not a coated tank and there's no signs of rust, it's in pretty good shape, send it for a hydro. Now I've got a steel 72 in good shape. No reason why not. If it had a fresh hydro and a fresh visual, it's got your stickers on it. Fresh hydro, fresh visual. The hydro's stamped in here, 76, 81, 2000. That's the last one on this tank. It hasn't been tested for 20 years. The last visual was on there. This is my visual, actually, the Wet Shop, another dive store I owned many years ago. So if it has a fresh hydro and fresh visual, go diving. And the inside is good. You're all set to go. If it does have a coating on the inside, most dive stores will say, sorry, can't fill it. And they're quite right. But it simply means that they either don't know or are too lazy to remove the coating, because the coatings can be removed. That's right. They're tumbled out, usually tumbled out, using, I think it's aluminum carbide chunks. And you put it in a machine and it tumbles it. They put water and a bit of detergent in, a drop of detergent, and they tumble it, and they can actually scrape all that old paint and stuff off the inside. And so you get down to bare metal. And then you check the bare metal's in good shape, send it for a hydro and a visual, and if it passes, bada. Nice new tank. So, our 72 is good? You're darn right. They're wonderful tanks. Great for diving. Little lighter, little shorter, really good for old divers, smaller divers. And we used to make these into doubles, triples. They're easy to carry. When I was young and strong, not a problem. Triples were easy with these at one time. So don't throw out your old 72s. If worst comes to worst, go to my my other channel, Alec Peirce at the Ranch, and look up how to make scuba tank bells. Yeah, you can cut these off and put a ringer in there, and they make a great set of bells. You can have a whole set of bells hanging from your windmill like me. But yes, they're good old tanks, and yes, they can be saved. There you go, guys, asking those questions. That's enough. Thanks very much. Alec Peirce, Vintage Scuba. See you soon. I'm going diving. Bye.